At 73 years old, in a tuxedo, on live television, he dropped to the floor and did one-armed push-ups at the Oscars. Why would a man in his 70s feel the need to prove his strength in front of 40 million people? And what does that moment tell us about the life he had lived before it? Tonight, we're looking at the real story of Jack Palance, a man Hollywood sold as a monster, who in private signed his poetry with lots of love. The coal mines that shaped him. He wasn't born Jack Palance. He was born Vladimir Palanuk in 1919 in Latimer Mines, Pennsylvania, a coal patch town built on exhaustion. Rows of company houses leaned into each other like tired men. The air carried the metallic tang of anthracite dust. Even the trees looked subdued, their leaves powdered gray by the constant drift from the breakers. His parents were Ukrainian Catholic immigrants. They spoke their native tongue at home, prayed with fierce devotion, and worked with the quiet desperation of people who knew what hunger looked like in the old country. His father descended into the mines before sunrise and emerged long after the sky had turned black. Nearly 40 years underground eventually carved the breath from his lungs. Black lung disease claimed him slowly, as it did so many men of that valley. The family lived in the shadow of the 1897 Latimer massacre, where striking immigrant miners were gunned down by deputies. That memory lingered in the community like coal dust in the lungs, invisible but suffocating. Children grew up hearing stories of gunfire and betrayal as if they were bedtime tales. Palance later said, "I learned how to hate when I was a kid in the hard coal mines." Think about that for a moment. How much of a man's future is carved in childhood? How much of his anger is inherited like a surname? He described his youth as good in the way tough men sometimes do, playing near slag piles and birch trees, swimming in creeks that shimmered with an oily sheen. But the mines gave him something permanent, a hardness, a watchfulness. You learned early not to show weakness. You learned that the world was not kind, and that strength, physical or otherwise, was a form of currency. Years later, when cameras lingered on his face, that hardness would read as menace. But it began as survival. Boxing, bruises, and brutal honesty. Before Hollywood, he boxed professionally under the name Jack Brazo. The gym smelled of sweat and disinfectant. The ropes were frayed. The pay was thin. His self-reported record claimed 15 straight wins, most by knockout. Official records confirm at least one bout against future contender Joe Baxi. The rest. Likely rough club fights in mining towns where the crowd leaned so close you could feel their breath when you staggered. He later shrugged it off. "You must be nuts to get your head beat in for $200. There was no romance in his voice when he said it. No nostalgia. Just fact. But boxing gave him something no acting school could teach. It gave him timing. The way to measure distance with a glance. The stillness before a punch. The understanding that fear has a smell, and that men reveal themselves under pressure. When you watched him on screen, you weren't just seeing acting. You were seeing experience. The slight tightening of the jaw. The patient stare. The sense that violence, if it came, would be efficient. What does it do to a young man to learn, so early, that pain is transactional? The crash, and Hollywood's favorite lie. Here's the story Hollywood loved. During World War II, his B-24 bomber crashed. His face was supposedly burned beyond recognition. Surgeons rebuilt him. The reconstructed face became the most terrifying in cinema. It was a perfect origin story. Tragedy. Reconstruction. Transformation. There was indeed a crash. He was injured and discharged in 1944. But the rebuilt monster face narrative? Likely exaggerated by studio publicists who understood marketing better than truth. Palance hated that myth. "I know I'm no beauty," he once said, "but these are the features I was born with." Why did it bother him so much? Because the story turned him into something artificial, a freak accident made profitable. It erased the coal mines, the boxing ring, the immigrant roots. It replaced a lifetime of grit with a single dramatic event. How often does success come at the cost of your real identity? How many artists are rewritten by the very industry that elevates them? His face, angular, severe, unforgettable, became shorthand for danger. But to him, it was simply inheritance. Bone structure passed down from Ukrainian ancestors who had survived wars and winters without publicists to spin their survival into myth. The punch that changed Broadway. After the war, the GI Bill sent him to college. He studied journalism, then drama. Words fascinated him, perhaps because they offered a different kind of power than fists. On stage, he could shape emotion instead of absorbing it. Within weeks of arriving in New York, he was cast as an understudy for Marlon Brando in a streetcar named Desire. Imagine that pressure. Brando was lightning in human form, raw, magnetic, unpredictable. Palance watched from the wings, absorbing every gesture. One night backstage, working a punching bag with Brando, Palance missed. The punch landed on Brando's nose. Brando was hospitalized. The understudy stepped in, and critics noticed. A coal miner's son suddenly stood in the spotlight meant for the most electric young actor in America. Luck, fate, or preparation meeting accident. Sometimes history turns on a single misplaced punch. Sometimes opportunity arrives disguised as disaster. He didn't imitate Brando. He couldn't. His energy was different, colder, more contained. Where Brando smoldered, Palance glinted like steel. Fear on set, and off. In Panic in the Streets, he reportedly replaced a rubber prop gun with a real one during a scene, knocking co-star Richard Widmark unconscious. Whether embellished or not, stories like that followed him. Colleagues described him as the only actor they were ever physically afraid of. Directors sensed it too, that unpredictable charge he carried like static electricity. Yet off-camera, he was quiet, gentle with his children, uncomfortable at parties. He preferred painting landscapes on his ranch, writing poetry late at night, tending horses in silence. Isn't that contrast fascinating? The man who terrified audiences for decades was, at home, reserved and sentimental. The unpredictability on screen gave his villains a voltage that felt real, because sometimes it was rooted in something real. Not cruelty, not malice, but intensity held tightly under the surface. How many of us perform a role the world expects, while guarding a private self no one sees? 13 minutes that changed westerns. In Shane, he appears for fewer than 13 minutes. 13 minutes. As gunslinger Jack Wilson, dressed in black, he moves with eerie stillness. He doesn't shout. He doesn't snarl. He barely raises his voice. He simply exists, coiled, patient, lethal. When he tells a homesteader, "Pick it up," referring to a fallen gun, the line lands like a verdict. Westerns had villains before. But Palance's performance shifted something. He made evil quiet, controlled, professional. What if menace doesn't need volume? What if the most frightening man in the room is the calmest? Those 13 minutes echoed for decades. Actors studied them. Directors referenced them. The camera loved his angular face, the way shadows cut across it like fault lines. And yet, he remained strangely outside the Hollywood inner circle. Too intense. Too private. Too unwilling to flatter. Years of nominations, and silence. He was nominated for Academy Awards for Sudden Fear and Shane. He lost both times. Hollywood admired him, but cautiously. He wasn't easy. He didn't charm journalists. He didn't play the publicity game with enthusiasm. There were stretches when work slowed. European films. Television appearances. Roles that paid the bills but didn't ignite the culture. Was he too authentic for an industry built on illusion? In interviews, he could be blunt to the point of discomfort. He disliked superficial praise. He distrusted executives. The coal miner's son never fully relaxed among studio moguls. And yet he kept working. Decade after decade. His face aging into something even more striking, the lines deepening, the gaze sharpening. The Renaissance. Then came City Slickers. As Curly, the grizzled cowboy with a philosophical streak, Palance found something new, warmth layered over toughness. He delivered lines about the one thing that matters in life with gravelly sincerity. Audiences who had feared him now loved him. In 1992, at 73 years old, he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The applause was thunderous, not just for the performance, but for the lifetime behind it. And then came the push-ups. On live television. In a tuxedo. One-armed. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't a stunt rehearsed for attention. It was a statement. I'm still here. I'm still strong. You don't get to define me by age, by myth, or by the roles I played. The crowd roared. Younger actors laughed in disbelief. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Why did that moment resonate so deeply? Because it wasn't just about physical strength. It was about endurance. About a boy from a coal patch town who had outlasted trends, myths, and decades of typecasting. The private poet. Few people talk about his poetry. On his ranch, away from premieres and flashbulbs, he wrote verses about mountains, silence, memory. He painted landscapes. He signed letters tenderly. The man who had embodied cinematic violence carried an interior world that was reflective, even romantic. What does it say about us that we so easily accept one dimension of a person, the villain, the tough guy, and ignore the rest? He once remarked that the camera captured what was already there. Maybe that's true. But it never captured everything. The final years. He continued working into his 80s. The body slowed. The voice deepened further. But the eyes remained alert. When he passed away in 2006, tributes emphasized the push-ups, the villains, the unforgettable face. But the fuller story stretches further back, to coal dust and immigrant prayers, to boxing rings and Broadway accidents, to a lifetime of resisting being simplified. At 73, on live television, he dropped to the floor not because he had something to prove. He did it because he could. And perhaps because somewhere inside him still lived Vladimir Palanuk, the miner's son who understood that strength, once earned, is not easily surrendered. So the next time you see that clip, ask yourself, what myths have shaped the people you admire? What parts of their stories were edited out? And what quiet strength might be hiding behind the roles we think define them? Because sometimes, the most powerful act isn't playing the monster. It's refusing to let the world decide who you are. As gunfighter Jack Wilson in Shane, Jack Palance delivered one of the most chilling villains in cinema history. A performance so icy, so controlled, that it earned him an Academy Award nomination and etched his name into Hollywood legend. He barely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His slow drawl, the way he stood too still, the way his eyes seemed to measure a man's soul before deciding whether it was worth ending, all of it made audiences uneasy. Children hid behind theater seats. Adults shifted uncomfortably. But here's the irony. He was terrified of horses. The towering gunfighter who seemed born in the saddle? He dreaded mounting up. Director George Stevens quietly worked around it, reusing the same dismount shot and adjusting Palance's entrance so he approached slowly on foot instead of riding hard into town. That measured, deliberate walk, born from fear, made Jack Wilson even more ominous. Fear became art. How often does that happen in life? How often does the thing we try hardest to hide become the very source of our power? Coal dust and quiet determination. Long before the black hat and the cold stare, he was Vladimir Palanuk, the son of Ukrainian immigrants in Pennsylvania coal country. His father worked underground. The mines were dark, suffocating places where strength wasn't theatrical, it was survival. As a boy, he watched men emerge from the earth coated in soot, their faces lined with exhaustion. That was masculinity to him. Not applause. Not camera lights. Endurance. He boxed in his youth, fighting his way through local circuits with a relentless, almost punishing discipline. Then came World War II. As a bomber pilot in the U.S. Army Air Forces, he survived a plane crash that left his face severely burned. Surgeons rebuilt his features. The high cheekbones and sharp angles that later made him look so dangerous on screen were, in part, the result of reconstruction. Pain reshaped him, literally. Did that experience harden him? Or did it carve out the quiet resilience people mistook for menace? Betrayal and the long wait. Hollywood began to notice him in the early 1950s. He received an Oscar nomination for Sudden Fear. Doors seemed to open. Then came the promise. He was told he would have a role in Viva Zapata, a major production directed by Elia Kazan and starring Marlon Brando. It felt like the next step, the solidifying moment. But the role went instead to Anthony Quinn. Quinn won the Oscar that same year Palance was nominated. The role he expected. The award he hoped for. Both gone. How do you recover from that? From watching another man accept the trophy you imagined holding? Hollywood drifted away. The phone rang less. Scripts grew thinner. He took work in Europe, spaghetti westerns, smaller productions, roles that paid the bills but not the ego. He acted not for glory, but for survival. Was he bitter? Perhaps. Or perhaps he simply understood something others didn't. Careers are seasons, not straight lines. Television revived him. In Requiem for a Heavyweight, he delivered a raw, aching performance that reminded audiences he wasn't just a villain. He was an actor of depth and bruised humanity. Still, decades passed without the golden statue. How long can a man wait before he stops believing redemption is possible? The night of the push UPS. Then came City Slickers. He worked only 10 days. Curly Washburn, grizzled, wise, half-mocking and half-mentor, felt like a wink at his own image. The leathery face. The desert landscape. The quiet authority. At 73 years old, Jack Palance won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He walked slowly to the podium. Host Billy Crystal had teased him throughout the evening, joking about his age. Palance delivered a few gruff words, then suddenly dropped to the floor and performed one-armed push-ups. The audience gasped. Then roared. Crystal threw out his script and improvised the rest of the night. Why did Palance do it? He later shrugged and said he didn't know what else to do. But maybe he did. After 40 years of near misses, fading relevance, and watching younger stars eclipse him, he needed a moment that could not be ignored. Not a speech. Not gratitude. A physical declaration. I am still strong. I am still here. I am not done. Have you ever felt invisible in a room you once dominated? Have you ever wanted one unmistakable act that forced the world to look at you again? That was his. And in that single gesture, the aging villain became something else, an emblem of defiance against time itself. The vegetarian villain. Here is where the myth fractures. He owned a 1,000-acre cattle ranch in California, a landscape of rolling hills and open sky. He was also a committed vegetarian. He painted impressionist landscapes in bold strokes and vibrant colors. In 1996, he published a poetry collection titled The Forest of Love, filled with romantic verse and his own drawings. He signed copies, Lots of Love, often sketching a tiny smiling face beside his name. The man who once knocked out a co-star during a heated moment on set couldn't bring himself to harm his cattle. What does that tell us about appearances? At home, the fearsome screen gunfighter took out the trash when his wife asked. He cooked. He gardened. He valued privacy fiercely. Was the villain merely a costume? Or was gentleness his true rebellion? Grief behind the strength. In 1998, tragedy struck. His son Cody died of melanoma. At the memorial service, the towering, gravel-voiced actor stood to speak and broke down. Words failed him. Tears came instead. Strength on screen. Vulnerability in life. How many men of his generation were taught to bury emotion? How many carried grief in silence? For Palance, there was no script. No director to call, cut. Only a father facing loss. And perhaps in that moment, stripped of character and myth, he was most fully himself. I'm Ukrainian. I'm not Russian. In 2004, at age 85, he attended a Russian film festival in Hollywood. Representatives offered him an honorary title from the government of Vladimir Putin. He stood up and refused. My parents were born in Ukraine. I'm Ukrainian. I'm not Russian. And he walked out. For decades, he had supported Ukrainian causes, narrated documentaries about famine and war, and interviewed survivors whose stories the world often overlooked. Identity mattered. Roots mattered. He had spent a lifetime playing roles written by others. But this line, this declaration, he wrote himself. How many of us wait until late in life to finally say out loud who we are? The final scene. He died in 2006 at age 87, surrounded by family. Ukrainian bandura music played softly in the room, a sound that carried him back to the immigrant community where his life began. His memorial was held at St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Church in Pennsylvania. From coal dust to Oscar gold. From boxing rings to poetry books. From villain to vegetarian. From overlooked actor to unforgettable legend. Billy Crystal later said the one-armed push-ups linked them forever. But perhaps the greater link is this. A man who made a career out of playing monsters never wanted to be a myth. He wanted paint on his hands, poetry on paper, quiet mornings on a ranch, family dinners without cameras. We all wear masks in our careers. We all perform versions of ourselves for survival. But who are we when the cameras stop rolling? Who are we when the applause fades? Is it the terrifying gunfighter standing alone in a dusty street? Or the 73-year-old man dropping to the floor, proving he could still rise? Maybe it's both. And maybe that's the lesson Jack Palance leaves behind. Strength is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to walk forward anyway, slowly, deliberately, and let even your weakness become unforgettable.